spray droplets more uniform and reducing drift. There's adjuvants for that as well. One thing to mention, whether you're tank mixing adjuvants or tank mixing multiple chemicals, you're responsible for what happens if you mix products without label tank directions. So we always advise that if you're mixing products, look to the label to make sure that they can be mixed. If they can't, I would highly suggest looking to some outreach staff within OMAFRA or within the industry to see if they are compatible. But again, if you are mixing stuff and there's no label directions, you're responsible for what happens. It's not only what can happen with the application equipment in terms of things like the screens clogging up, or you get a nice film on the side of your on the sides of your tank, and there's residue there that's hard to clean up. But it's also the potential for it to injure your crop, or mixing chemicals that are actually counteracting with the chemicals that have the active ingredient in them. So there's adjuvants that you can mix with glyphosate that actually reduce the effectiveness of glyphosate considerably. So again, when tank mixing, just make sure that there's label directions, and if there's not, in terms of damage to your tank or crop injury, that's something that you're at risk. So I will. That's it for the label. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the quiz that I mentioned earlier, where it kind of walks through a Matador label. And these questions are going to be similar to the questions you get on the exam. On page 50. If everyone could turn to page 50, that's the, we're going to draw the questions from there, and I'm just going to minimize the amount that you're going to have to answer. If you got a pen handy, just circle these ones. Question 1, I'll wait for everyone to get to page 50. So questions 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, 12, 14, 15, and 16. So we're using the Matador label that's in the blue right after page 52. So we're drawing all of our answers from that Matador label. So I'll just give everyone a quick, we'll take this up together as well. So I'll give 5 to 10 minutes for everyone to go through that. Some people have it done already, I find, if they did some work on them, but like this gentleman here. So you get an extra long break. And right up to question 8, you're only using the first page of the Matador label. So. Oh, yeah, you got it done too. So do you? Oh, is that where you teach it?
No,
Oh.
I just take your suggestions.
Oh,
and just
yeah.
highlight.
Well, sometimes it takes too long. And yeah, not all of these. I just draw the ones that I know are you run into on these.
Yeah.
So it's a good exercise, but it can be long.
I
Yeah.
usually end up just doing the first 6.
Yeah. You know what? I thought I'd take some of these. Yeah. I generally just finish. As long as I get these 2 done, I can just say anything gets passed. They quite often people just want to break because they spend developing.
One thing I've seen to do is I go around and say, questions.
Yeah. Yeah.
same result. It's the same result.
Yeah. It's a big class, it's a lot to get participation.
It's always hard.
Yeah.
Whenever you have time, no rush.
Right, okay, thanks. I will change it right on here. Yeah, yeah, no, that's great.
Oh, yeah.
Changes to the book. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's very good.
Well, the thing so far that I really liked, I never use that. I never mentioned your macro publications, and I
Oh,
don't use
yeah.
that video, I like all three of them, so yeah. This little nuggets falling into place, yeah. There you go.
Below 500.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. This is nephew. He's out with he loves the video. He's teaching science with kids. So we tell him, he's yeah, no, he's fun. Young girl. Life keeps going. She read it. Yeah, she was surprised.
How's everyone doing for, if you get past 12, we'll take them all up anyways, and those are the main ones, but. Oh, the buffer zone? Yeah, so that's the end.
This one is specific one, not here. Of this one, buffer side, that is not here.
Really good.
What's the question here?
When you apply, you should use spirit of the calculation of that.
Right, so you just say lower than medium.
Yeah.
That's all you say. Or sorry, coarser than medium, or not lower than medium.
So do not apply lower than medium, and do not apply lower than medium, and lower than medium.
Or just don't apply lower than medium. I'm not picky. So if you identify that
Yeah.
medium's like the cutoff,
Yeah.
then I know what you're talking about.
So,
So you can say it's got to be more than medium, or it can't be less than medium. Either answer's fine. Yeah, no worries.
thank you.
Yeah. Pardon me? Okay. One thing you'll notice with those labels is they have headings in them, and those headings are valuable for trying to find information. So if you're talking about, again, something that might be related to first aid, you'll look at the headings that talk about toxicological information or first aid. I believe there's headings for field applicator and air blast applicator, so if you're looking for something related to those, see those headings. For safety equipment. Yeah, so that'll be under precaution.
I think we're good, yeah. Okay, already.
It's hidden in this one. So you'll just see,
I was trying to keep these okay.
yeah, you'll see all the safety,
Oh, there it is.
personal protection equipment. And then so during mixing and loading, there's additional ones, so that would be, that's why mixing and loading are older than that question. Let's get to this mixing and loading. Mixing and loading. So look over the personal protection. So we're looking for protection. And precaution. So we're seeing a lot of stuff here. Yeah.
More than required to be safe. It's not happening.
So then it says we're mixing and loading, so everything after notice, but also after chemical, chemical products, shield, restaurant. We'll take up those answers soon if everyone wants to take a quick stretch and coffee, just to keep the morning rolling and stay on schedule.
So you have the fingerprints coming from this data? You have fingerprints coming from there? Why do you less than why only
It's 260. Let's figure out the buffer. Buffer zone.
That's what you have.
Or two. Long. One time. So I put you guys turn this right and put on it. Stay with me. Yeah. On it.
We are not spending.
Spring records.
We are not spending them, it's correct.
We'll have both of your 55 body weight. That's a condition. There's
Yeah, I told you to figure out 260 to the big buffer.
So let's figure out how to reduce the buffer zones. You guys all know. Yeah, we'll go.
Yeah, but I want to be able to pull it. So if you're setting something up, you don't have to move. You get to move.
Okay, just to stay on top of things and on top of schedule, we'll go over these. I'll just go over them. I'll just look for answers from anyone who wants to, who has the right answer. Starting with number one, and I'll point out where on the label we're finding these as well, for if someone didn't get them. Again, we'll go to where it is on the label, just so you have an idea of where we're drawing these from, and it'll help you out on the exam. So for the first question, the name of the pesticide, did anyone? Yeah. So it's Matador, and again, that's on the first page of the label or the principal display panel at the top. So the trade name is Matador, or Matador 120. The formulation, and this is sometimes people get confused with formulation. We went over it on the course, though. Anyone get the formulation for this one? Yeah.
Emulsifiable concentrate?
Yeah, it's an emulsifiable concentrate, which is a type of liquid, and we'll always see that fairly close to the product name in the general area. So on the top half of the label is usually where we're going to see that formulation. We can see here it's right under the product name Matador. We see emulsifiable concentrate. So that's just another hint, using pages 63, 64, 65, and also knowing that you're going to find it on the top half of the label. Question 4, the concentration or the guarantee.
120 grams per liter.
Yeah, 120 grams per liter, and that's of lambda-cyhalothrin. We can see that right under guarantee, we get the active ingredient as well as the concentration of 120 grams per liter on the principal display panel, first page of the label. If I'm going too quick and you're not seeing where I'm getting these answers, just let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. The name of the company that makes the pesticide? Yeah, Syngenta, and that's at the bottom of that'll always be at the bottom of the principal display panel, first page of the label. And the registration number.
24984.
Yeah, and again, that's always going to be on the front of the label as well, first page. Number 7, the symbol on the principal display panel.
Poison.
Poison, yep. So we see the skull and bones, and it's bordered by an octagon, so that means that the degree of hazard is
High.
yeah. Did anyone get the kind of bonus answer about the acute oral LD50?
Less than 500 mg.
Yeah, less than 500
Milligram per
milligrams per kilogram. And we got that answer from page 41. There's a chart on page 41. So we can see that based on the hazard symbol we're seeing on the label, on page 41, we can see what the acute LD50s are for various routes of exposure. So for oral, we can see if we go across from oral LD50 at the top page of 41 and we go under the danger poison, we can see that it's less than 500 milligrams per kilogram. I believe some of you might see that on the exam, so if you flag page 41, that chart might come in handy for the exam if you run into that question for the labels. And the mode of action or the group number, which we're going to talk about shortly after this quiz.
3.
Yeah, 3. So the group number or the mode of action is always going to be at the top right-hand corner of the first page of the label or the principal display panel. And that is going to be important when it comes to resistance, as well as just knowing, just knowing what the group number is and how it is related to the mode of action. So when we say group number and mode of action, those terms are almost interchangeable. So that should help you out for the exam in a few places. So this is 3, top right hand corner. So now we're getting into the secondary display panel. Question 9, if you get it on your skin, anyone get that answer?
Clothing wash for 15 to 20 minutes and call it poison control.
Right, so wash for 15 to 20 minutes, call poison control. And we're getting that on the second page of the label under first aid, which we would expect to see it. So using those headings, and 3 paragraphs down, if on skin, remove clothing, wash for 15, 20 minutes, call poison control. Quite often, if we see questions like this on the exam, if you can give two parts to the answer, so wash for 15, 20 minutes, call poison control, they're generally worth 2 marks unless stated otherwise, so giving those 2 points Be good. 11, personal equipment for mixing and loading. And again, mixing and loading is highlighted because there's some additional requirements. Generally speaking, when we're talking about risk of exposure, mixing and loading is a high risk activity, so we're going to need more more personal protective equipment. Anyone rhyme out that exhausting list?
Lungs, one sleeve shirt, respirator.
Yeah. And then gloves, safety goggles, yeah. Yeah, and a respirator. Yeah, so again, those last 3 items are additional items. If mixing and loading, not just handling, that you need on top of the requirements for handling. So that's great. That's under precautions. Under the second point, under precautions, you'll see all that safety equipment, personal protective equipment requirements. And that's on the 3rd page of the label. For number 12, how long must the farmer stay out of the treated area, or what's the REI?
24 hours.
24 hours, yeah. So this is also under precautions, and it's point 3 under precautions on page 3. The REI is 24 hours. So again, no hand labor for 24 hours. The strict restricted entry. Oh, I gave you 14 and I shouldn't have. Sorry about that. But anyone get that about where to dispose of empty containers?
Yeah. Container collection site.
Yeah, the nearest container collection site. Quite often, the local retail that you got the products from will be part of the Clean Farms program and should take back empty containers. But when you apply Matador with a field sprayer, what nozzle should you use? Classification. And again, we're looking at field sprayer, so I'm looking at the top of page 5, and it mentions field sprayer application as a heading. So under there, we can see that it's a medium classification, no lower than a medium classification. So you're looking for medium or coarser for a field sprayer, which will be a typical answer for nozzle requirements on a label. It will usually give you kind of the cutoff of how fine you can actually go with your nozzles. And for this one, it's medium and nothing finer. So again, that's on page 5 under field sprayer application. It mentions nothing smaller than medium classification under field sprayer. When you apply Matador with the field sprayer, how far away must you be from freshwater habitat? There's a nice buffer zone chart on page 7. Quite often you'll see buffer zones in a chart very similar to this.
15 meters.
15 meters, yeah. So it doesn't matter the depth because for the field sprayer it's consistent. For all sensitive areas it's 15 meters, which includes freshwater habitat. So on the chart on page 7, we're looking at field sprayer, 15 meters. You can see if it's for an air blast, using Matador in an air blast, the buffer zone requirements are more restrictive, so it jumps up to 80 meters. But for the sake of the answer, we're looking at 15 meters. And yeah, that's it. So the questions on the exam pertaining to the label are going to be very similar to that, in which they're asking you questions and you're drawing the answers from the label. So using the headings, identifying things like the buffer zone chart, where you might be able to find that. And you'll also get some resistance questions as well. So you'll see some resistant management information on the label that will help you out with any questions regarding resistance. So we'll keep moving along. That's a good segue into pesticide resistance. And these slides can sometimes lean towards weeds more than anything, but I tried to gear this more towards what pests you'll be concerned about on your operation. But for pesticide resistance, 2 things need to occur for it to happen. There needs to be genetic diversity, and there also has to be a means of selection. So when we use the same product over and over again on the pest, we are selecting for genetic diversity and selecting for that resistance. And we'll get into examples of that. And we also mentioned the mode of action or the group number, and it's the way the pesticide works to control the pest. So multiple active ingredients or multiple products can have the same mode of action or group number, which is why it's important to draw that group number from the label, know what group you're using for your pest control or throughout your IPM program. And ideally, you want to use different modes of action or different groups throughout the season. And again, that's just to reduce the selection of resistance. Quite often, because products with the same group number, again, are going to kill the pest the same way. So if they grow resistance to that mode of action, they're going to be resistant to multiple chemicals that are within that same group number. And again, using insecticides as an example, if it affects the if it's a growth rate, if it affects the growth or the growth of the exoskeleton of the particular pest, and you use that mode of action that affects that growth of that exoskeleton, and you use it multiple times, you're going to possibly grow resistance to that because the insects are going to, through generations, become resistant because you're selecting for that genetic diversity by using the same product over again. If you mix it up and now you get you use something that is a neurological pesticide that affects it in a different mode of action, now you're starting to control different ways, killing multiple pests and not selecting for that diversity. So this is a good example here. So if this is assuming we're using the same mode of action, and we have our set of pests, and there's genetic diversity in there, and maybe there's a mutation. So these red ones are not affected by the spray or the mode of action of the spray that you're using. So after one spray, we get rid of the black ones, but the red ones are still there, and they're going to multiply, and they're going to carry on the genes to the next generation. And if we use the same spray after that, it's only going to further escalate. And again, this is the selection process. By using the same spray, we are selecting for these red ones, and they're reproducing, and they're giving off their genes and allowing their offspring to become resistant to the spray. So switching up this second spray with a different mode of action, again, you're going to be more implementation in terms of multiple controls, multiple modes of actions, and you're not going to see this selection. And there are biotypes out there that are insecticide, do have resistance to insecticides, and these are the different group numbers of where we see that resistance. So it looks like there's 6 for insecticides. This number's grown for herbicides. It's more than that now. We now have group 14 in there. And fungicides is group 3 and 11. So biotypes are out there, they exist, and it's up to us on our operation to use different mode of actions so we don't express or select for those, to allow the resistance to happen. And one of the main, actually I'm going to just skip through the weed stuff. This is a good example of how selection pressure can occur though. So Roundup, highly utilized in field crops. These are the market shares, and we see here between 2008 and 2010 is where we started to get a lot of resistance problems creeping in the Essex region. Again, they're migrating from the States. So again, the two things needed for resistance is the biotype needs to be there or exist, and once it's there in the field, we need to select for it to proliferate. So no surprise here that when we got up to a high amount of Roundup use around 2010, we started seeing a lot of resistant weeds start to come in. Fleabane and ragweed, giant ragweed, and now water hemp is a big one that we're dealing with. So again, overusing Roundup, not mixing other chemicals in there to help control those resistant biotypes that exist in the field, allows them to seed. Those seeds are in the field, regenerate for next year, and if we're still using Roundup, those weeds for the next year are going to grow and seed as well. So the same idea with fruits as well, except the only difference is sometimes you have multiple generations within a season for certain pests. So this whole cycle of selection can actually be quite a bit faster than what we might see in a field setting. So again, using integrated pest management, which we talked about, and we talked about the importance of the mode of action to help use integrated pest management. And the mode of action, again, is different groups. So identifying the groups of the products that you're using. So I have an activity that's going to just give us an example of how we can identify what group numbers belong to certain products, and get an idea of what rotation we have. And I don't know if this is a real life scenario, because I don't know how accurate this would be for an apple grower to be using this much product in a year. But I handed out 2 sheets. One is this chart here, and the other one is a list of products from publication 360. So if you don't have one, your closest neighbor might have one. And what we're doing here is we're going to be looking at the chemical rotation throughout this apple orchard, and we're going to try and look up the mode of action from this chart, which is taken from publication 360. So on the left of the chart, we're going to have the product name. So correspond that with the product name on the chart. And you can see 3 rows down, we have the group number. So we can see what group belongs to what product. And we're just going to see how many groups throughout this chemical rotation we have. And again, this will help you see the significance of trying to identify the group numbers and how it correlates to a group rotation, but and what that means for resistance. So a sale would be AS. Yeah, so the group numbers, yeah, exactly.
Okay, forming that A, C, and A.
Yeah,
What is that, the lettering, is that?
That's just the chemical group that it's part of. So I believe A is neonics and C, but the mode of action remains. It might be a little bit different in terms of how it responds to resistance, but
Is it different enough to?
not as effective as using a 4. Like that's going to be
That's right.
in terms of
We're
should have-
rated
Okay, you should get out of that.
yeah, you should get out of group this.
Yeah.
How many different groups?
And yeah, I should explain, because we don't, we deal with that with insecticides and even fungicides, but we don't see that really.
So are there any
As long as we don't use the same one all the time.
concerns?
So for the first question, I'm going to say that all group 4s are going to be the same group, even if it's 4A or 4C.
Oh, they're the same.
They're the same. So the only thing that does is it identifies the chemical group that it belongs to, but the
The A
mode of
is the
action
same.
is the same.
Oh.
Yeah. So these, for example,
So
these.
the actual chemical would be
The-
different.
Yeah. So 4A just
Okay,
is
yeah.
only referring to neonics, but the
Oh.
mode of action between neonics and 4C is the same.
Oh.
That being said,
1, 2, 3, 4. That changes my answer.
yeah.
Alright.
Okay. So there's more. Did everyone get that? Is everyone done? Oh, I had the answers up here. Whoops.
Not all of them.
Not all of them, yeah.
It's not that.
That was just to inspire us.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what's full up
Just
with
some
the bosses.
confirmation that you got
Yeah,
the first couple right,
confirmation.
yeah. Okay, so how many groups altogether throughout this chemical rotation? 4, yeah. And are there any concerns with that? And again, I'm looking for answers more from you than, I'm not gonna stand here and tell you there's a special one for apple orchards and insecticide use.
I'm assuming those first three are all like the early season.
Yeah, so first generation, and I think I say on the chart that apple is the closest for early season. So this is kind of evolving throughout the season.
So you're looking at early season resistance, you're starting off on a really bad foot,
Yeah,
kinda.
exactly. Right. And when we talk about, and where I was trying to draw some, and this is all from Pub 360, I'm not by any means knowledgeable of this stuff before kind of looking into this, but when we look at first and second generation as well, and potentially assuming we're looking at first and second generation of the same pest, we're using the same product for both generations as well, which is a huge concern. Because when we talk about selection and trying to control the same pest, yeah.
That is probably the worst scenario, if you had that same reverse, like you had the group 4s at the end of the season.
Right.
That wouldn't be as much of a problem.
Right.
Is that right?
So what I did see was using the same product, depending on the type of pest you're doing in terms of overlaying, if they have overlaying generations or if they don't. That will also tell you if group rotation is as important as opposed if it's not. So if they're not overlaying generations, it's really important to switch up your group numbers from the first application to the second. If they are, then using the same one consecutively twice is not as, and we're talking about a single pest here. But when we talk about the chemical control of it all, because some of these will actually have maybe not full control, but suppression control, or and when you talk about suppression or low rates or anything like that, from residual kind of what you're not getting your target, that can also apply to how pests become resistant as well. So looking into that and having just a good general throughout the whole season, so that whole chart having good rotation is really important. But when it's a bit more complicated with insects and insecticides, because again, we have a lot of things at play here in terms of generations, what your targets are, what their life cycles are as well. So you can have your overall scheme of things and group rotation and how that's important, but between two applications within that are also very important as well in terms of a first generation application and second, and having good group rotation just between those two applications. So lots of concerns here when we talk about only having 4 and we have overlapping groups for first and second generation control. Yeah, it's just something to kind of open you up to the group rotation, the mode of action rotation, and how that's going to apply in terms of maintaining and improving IPM for resistance control on the operation. So that's from publication 360, that chart that has all those mode of actions. So when we talk about where to draw these mode of actions, we can get it from the label, and those charts also exist in publication 360. That might be a question on the exam. So where do you find these mode of actions or these group numbers? So I'll leave that with you guys too. So hopefully everyone has a copy, and you can keep that. But so I already mentioned this, so I'm going to just keep moving along. But one thing we do have to realize too is when we're assessing our control, we have to rule out that there's any other application error or error with our IPM system before we just identify that we have resistance as well. Again, that helps us properly respond, prepare to help manage and control the resistance. So it's something to keep in mind. We'll motor right into environmental, and I'm going to check the time to make sure that I'm okay. Gee, before we do that, is there any questions on that? Like sometimes that particular section provokes some discussion or questions, but is everyone pretty familiar with kind of what the mode of actions mean and how they apply to resistance management? Everyone's pretty good with that. And I focused on insecticides, but again, it's It's also for fungicides as well. And actually fungicides labels in general are really good for making sure that they're notifying you not to make more than a certain amount of applications throughout a year, and they're also advising to mix that fungicide with another one if you are able to as well. So those resistant management things in the label are, again, directly related to what we just discussed in terms of rotating group numbers and mode of actions in your tank mixes or throughout the season on different applications. So, all right.
May be taken up by plants or be ingested by insects or soil organisms, or it may adhere to soil particles, be carried off in the air, or move in water. There is always some risk to the environment. The degree of environmental risk depends upon 4 factors. Persistence, how long the pesticide remains active in the environment. Mobility, how easily the pesticide can move from where it was applied. Non-target toxicity, how toxic the pesticide is to organisms other than the pest. And volume of use, how much of that pesticide is used in the environment. The physical and chemical properties of pesticides, as well as natural processes, influence their environmental risk. By considering these properties and processes before you use a pesticide, you will be able to maximize pest control and minimize environmental risk. First, let's review 5 properties of pesticides that can affect their fate in the environment. Pesticides can be broken down by organisms, chemical reactions, and sunlight. This is called degradation. How fast this happens depends on the pesticide and the environmental conditions on your farm. If the soil is warm and moist, for example, microbes quickly consume the pesticide and turn it into other molecules such as carbon dioxide and water. Pesticides that do not break down quickly are called persistent. An example of a moderately persistent pesticide is atrazine, which has been found in surface and groundwater across Ontario. Pesticides may bioaccumulate or build up in body tissues such as animal fats. These pesticides may then biomagnify or build up in the food chain. Adsorption is the binding of pesticides.
Sorry about that. My finger hit a wrong button. I was just trying to.
Soil particles and organic matter. The way a pesticide binds to the surface of the soil.
I'm having a rough morning today with
magnetic attraction.
this equipment. I can't do anything right.
Not bad, though. I've seen worse.
Yeah. If it's not the equipment itself, it's the operator. Yeah.
I told my computer it's never the operator.
They have these buttons in the weirdest places.
Well, they do.
Yeah.
Whoever's human, who really screwed up these computers.
Yeah, now you're talking.
Okay, let's try and get this back to where we want it.
Soil particles eroded by adsorption is the binding of pesticides onto soil particles and organic matter. The way a pesticide binds to the surface of the soil particle is similar to magnetic attraction. Soils that are high in organic matter or clay are the most absorptive. A pesticide absorbed tightly in the soil may move with soil particles eroded by wind or water and is less likely to be degraded by soil microorganisms. Pesticides can move into organisms like plants and insects, or structures like soil or wood, similar to the way that water moves into a sponge, and this is called absorption. Once inside the tissue of an organism, the organism may break it down so that it is no longer harmful to that organism. This reduces the hazard of pesticide residues remaining in food. Pesticides may change into a vapor when exposed to air, similar to how water evaporates. This is called pesticide volatility. Once a pesticide volatilizes, it can travel for miles. The fate of pesticides in the environment is determined by a combination of these 5 properties, plus how pesticides move through the natural processes of drift, surface runoff, leaching, and soil erosion. You can reduce pesticide movement in these natural processes by your farming practices. To reduce drift, there are many things you can do, such as using nozzles that produce larger spray droplets, or lowering the boom of your sprayer. Surface runoff of pesticides can be reduced by no-till and minimum tillage practices, which also reduce pesticide movement via soil erosion. Leaching is the movement of water down through the soil, potentially to tile lines and surface waters, or to groundwater. Adsorptive pesticides are less likely to leach because they stick to organic matter. To increase the amount of organic matter in your soil, add manure and crop residues. You can also prevent pesticides from entering the environment by handling pesticides with care. Store pesticides properly so they do not contaminate people or the environment. For any spilled pesticides, make sure you clean it up properly. Call the Spills Action Center for helpful advice. When you're done spraying, correctly dispose of your empty containers, including triple rinsing and returning them to a pesticide container collection site. An integrated pest management approach can help control pests without pesticides. If you choose to use a pesticide, completely read the entire product label and check for environmental precautions. For instance, you may need to leave a buffer zone of unsprayed natural vegetation to protect sensitive water sources or animal habitat. Or, to prevent poisoning of bees, be sure to avoid applying insecticides on flowering crops or when bees are foraging. Before you use a pesticide, consider all the pesticide properties, natural processes, and practices you can do to protect your crops and the environment.
Yeah, so she talked about some terms and precautions and things for environmental risk. And whenever we talk about environmental risk or human health risk, formulas are used to assess what that risk might look like. And some of the things we can't control, it's very chemical or product dependent in terms of persistent or even weather dependent as well, in terms of persistence, mobility, and non-target toxicity. But again, we can control the volume of use or how we use it and making sure that we're using it properly to avoid any exposure to the environment. So again, the greater amount of pesticide we use is always going to increase the environmental risk of that particular product. And when we choose to use it and how we choose to use it is going to certainly affect the mobility of it as well. In terms of trying to reduce drift, not spraying before a rain, things like that. So pesticide fate, and we talked about some of these physical processes, but it's affected by physical processes, but it also is very dependent on the chemical as well. So things that can break down pesticides is degradation, which is can be by microbes, sunlight, and dependent on the chemical as well, and it's measured by half-life. Obviously, the greater half-life that a chemical has or is associated with, the longer or more persistent it is, longer it takes to break down. There's also pesticide fate within organisms as well. So we have bioaccumulation here, and we can see that's in a single organism. It's exposed to the product, gets into the bloodstream, stored in fatty tissues, and again, concentrations increase as exposure increases or multiple exposures occur, and depending on that, we could have effects. So not to be confused with biomagnification, which is just the movement of the product throughout the food chain itself, not in a single organism particularly. The video also touched on chemical processes and physical processes as well. I always present these as kind of a catch-22 because they could be very good things if you hit your target, but they're bad things if you're missing your target and it's going on to non-targets. So the ability for it to bind to particles and is absorption, and again we're looking at the magnet here, and quite often that's associated with soil and the ability to bind to soil. So again, with that, the higher absorption it has, it's going to be bound to the soil and less prone to leach. But if that soil moves, it's going to move with it as well, whether it's wind erosion from wind or erosion from water, surface water. Absorption is the ability for it to move into organisms. So again, if it has that ability to move into your target quickly, and you reach that target, that's a positive. But if you're drifting and it's onto a non-target, it has the ability to move into that organism just as quickly as well. And volatility is the ability for it to change into a vapor. Different products will have different, will be more volatile than others. And when we talk about surface inversions or temperature inversions, volatility comes into play with that. So some natural processes, just looking at this diagram, we have drift. This can be spray drift, particle drift, vapor drift. Surface runoff, again, that can be avoided by making sure we're not looking at the monitoring the weather for rainfall following an application, leaching, the ability for it to move in through the soil, potentially contaminating groundwater wells, and soil erosion as well, which could be surface water or wind, are all natural processes of how pesticides move off target. So temperature inversions, and it comes into play a lot with field sprayer, just given the area that generally is being sprayed, as well as the chemicals and the potential for those chemicals to move. We talk about it with soil fumigation as well. But again, it's temperature inversions are when we have a hot day and at night the cool air, there's cool air near the ground as a result of that air cooling after sun sets, and it's trapped under the layer of warm air. And again, when we talk about density of air, cool air is going to stay trapped beneath that warm air, and we're going to get any small spray droplets or particles or vapor is going to be kind of trapped in that layer with the cold air. So we don't get mixing of the layers within the air, and as a result, nothing's settling. We don't have any turbulence bringing those to the ground. So it almost is like you're pouring water, down the landscape, and it's going to kind of flow along the landscape until something eventually deposits it, whether it's a gust of wind or if it just settles eventually. But it can take a long time if temperature inversions are occurring. So generally speaking, it's at night when the ground's starting to cool, is when it's starting to build, and it can last up to the morning, and we have inversions fading in the morning as the sun begins to rise, and it starts to heat that air near the ground again, and we have the mixing of the air. So again, this is important. We don't want to really be applying at these times if a surface inversion is occurring. So we want to identify if there's a potential for one. The best way to do that sometimes is to